I'm holding a photograph right now that ain't supposed to exist, shows a coastline defense position in California, February 1942. And if you look real close at the bottom right corner, there's a notation in pencil that says blind spot confirmed Dean observation validated post-incident, and that notation, that tiny little scribble that someone made in the margins of an official reconnaissance photo, that's the only physical evidence that remains of a week when a 22-year-old farm kid from Texas figured out something that naval intelligence officers with college degrees and years of training completely missed. And the reason this photograph survived when all the other documentation got buried is pure luck. It ended up in a personal collection, got passed down through families, and eventually made its way to me decades later. But the story it tells, the story of what really happened in the days after a Japanese submarine attacked American soil, that story never made it into any official history because acknowledging it would have required admitting that the entire command structure had failed to see an obvious tactical vulnerability until an enlisted man with an 8th grade education pointed it out. My name's James Dean, though everyone calls me Sergeant Dean now, even though I've been retired longer than most of you watching this been alive. And what I'm about to tell you happened 83 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday, not because it was traumatic or heroic or any of that Hollywood nonsense, but because it was the first time I understood that being right don't matter nearly as much as who you are when you're right, and that lesson, that cold hard truth about how organizations work and how hierarchies protect themselves, that stayed with me every day since, and it's why I'm telling these stories now, because the men who actually saw the threats and prevented the disasters, their names ain't in the history books. Their contributions got erased to protect officers who screwed up, and somebody needs to set the record straight before we're all dead and the lies become the only version that survives. February 23, 1942, 7:12 p.m. Pacific Time. I'm standing watch at a coastal observation post north of Santa Barbara. It's cold, it's foggy. Visibility maybe quarter mile on a good moment, and I'm thinking about absolutely nothing important, thinking about home probably, thinking about my daddy's ranch in Texas and whether the winter wheat came in good. And then the world explodes, not metaphorically, literally explodes. There's this boom that rattles my teeth and shakes the ground under my boots. And for maybe 3 seconds I got no idea what just happened, my brain can't process it, and then training kicks in and I'm on the field phone yelling, explosion south-southwest, approximately 2 miles, unknown origin. And across the line I hear other observation posts reporting the same thing, everyone's yelling, nobody knows what's happening. And then maybe 5 minutes later word comes down from command that a Japanese submarine surfaced and fired a torpedo at an oil facility near Elwood. And just like that, the war that had been happening on the other side of the Pacific Ocean was suddenly right here on the California coast. Now I need to stop right here and explain something about me because it matters for understanding what happened next. I grew up on a cattle ranch outside Amarillo, Texas. My daddy worked that land his whole life and I worked it alongside him from the time I was big enough to lift a fence post, and ranch work teaches you things that ain't in any military manual. Teaches you to notice when something's different, when a cow's acting wrong, when a waterhole's drying up faster than it should, when the fence line got a weak spot that's gonna break in the next storm, and you learn these things not from books but from paying attention, from spending hours every day looking at the same landscape until you know it so well that the smallest change jumps out at you, and that skill, that habit of noticing small details and asking why they changed. That's what I brought to the Army when I enlisted in 1940, didn't think of it as special, thought everyone could do it, but turned out most people can't or don't. They see what they expect to see and their brains fill in the rest, but I'd been trained by years of ranch work to see what's actually there, not what's supposed to be there. So when I'm standing watch that night after the explosion, and all hell's breaking loose with sirens and scrambling and officers yelling orders, I'm doing what I always do, which is looking at the details. And I notice something strange. There's a pattern to the waves hitting the beach that don't look right. They're coming in at slightly different intervals than they were an hour ago. And there's a reflection in the water maybe 300 yards offshore that catches the moonlight wrong, just for a second, gone before I can focus on it, and I mark it in my head. Probably nothing, probably just my imagination, but I mark it anyway because that's what you do. You notice the things that seem off and you file them away, and if you see them again, then maybe there's something worth investigating. Over the next 2 hours I see that same wrong-looking reflection 3 more times, always in roughly the same area, always just for a second or two, and I'm starting to think maybe I ain't imagining it. Maybe there's something out there, and around 2,100 hours another private on watch, kid named Kowalski from Chicago, he comes over and says, "Dean, you seeing something weird in the water out there?" And I say, "Yeah, like reflections that shouldn't be there," and he says, "I've been watching it for 40 minutes, thought I was going crazy, and now there's two of us seeing the same thing, which means either we're both crazy or there's actually something happening, and we decide we better report it." The officer on duty that night was Captain Richard Holloway, and I need to be careful how I talk about Holloway because he ain't alive to defend himself and I don't want to speak ill of the dead. But the truth is Holloway was not a good officer. He'd gotten his commission through political connections, not through competence. He had a law degree from some fancy East Coast school and a father who was friends with a senator, and he'd been assigned to coastal defense duty because it was considered safe, low risk, good for officers who needed military service on their resume but didn't actually want to see combat, and Holloway treated the assignment like an inconvenience. He resented being there, resented the enlisted men under his command, and especially resented anyone who suggested they knew something he didn't. So when Kowalski and I went to Holloway and reported what we'd been seeing, the weird reflections, the changed wave patterns, Holloway's first response was to laugh, not a friendly laugh, a dismissive, contemptuous laugh. And he said, "Gentlemen, are you naval architects? Are you experts in hydrodynamics? Because unless you've got degrees in oceanography, I suggest you leave the technical analysis to people who are qualified." And I said, "Sir, with respect, we're not doing technical analysis. We're just reporting what we observed." And Holloway said, "What you observed is moonlight on water. What you observed is your own nerves playing tricks after the attack. What you did not observe is anything that requires my attention. Now get back to your posts and stop wasting my time with farm boy superstitions." That phrase, farm boy superstitions, stuck with me, still sticks with me 83 years later, because it perfectly captured how Holloway saw us. We weren't soldiers making legitimate tactical observations. We were ignorant country kids who didn't know the difference between real threats and shadows, and nothing we could say would change his mind because he'd already decided we were too stupid to have valid input. But here's the thing, I've been called worse than farm boy. I am a farm boy, but being from a farm don't make you stupid. It makes you observant, makes you practical, makes you good at solving problems with limited resources. And all those qualities that Holloway dismissed as superstition were exactly the qualities needed to spot what he was missing. We went back to our posts like Holloway ordered, but we didn't stop watching, and over the next 3 hours those weird reflections kept appearing, and now a third man, Corporal Rodriguez, he'd started seeing them too, and the three of us started documenting everything, times, locations, duration, patterns, and what we noticed was the reflections were moving in a specific pattern, south to north along the coast, roughly parallel to the shoreline, maintaining approximately the same distance offshore, and that pattern, that methodical movement, that wasn't random moonlight on water, that was something with purpose and direction, and the only thing that made sense was a submarine periscope. And if there was a submarine out there operating within a few hundred yards of our position 3 hours after the torpedo attack, then that meant the Japanese weren't leaving, they were still here, they were observing us, and that was information command needed to have. At 0130 hours I made a decision that probably should have gotten me court-martialed. I went over Holloway's head. I used the field phone to contact the next observation post up the line, which was commanded by Lieutenant Morrison, different officer, better officer, someone who'd actually listen. And I explained what we'd been seeing, and Morrison said, "How certain are you about this?" And I said, "Sir, I'm a ranch kid from Texas. I spent my whole life watching for things that don't belong, and I'm telling you there is something out there that ain't supposed to be there." And Morrison said, "Okay, I'm going to send a patrol boat to investigate. If you're right, we need to know. If you're wrong, we wasted some fuel. Either way, it's worth checking." And that right there is the difference between a good officer and a bad one. Morrison was willing to investigate a report from an enlisted man even if it turned out to be nothing. Holloway wouldn't even consider the possibility he might be wrong. The patrol boat Morrison sent out didn't find a submarine. What they found was oil, fresh oil slick in exactly the area where we'd been seeing the reflections, and oil slicks don't appear naturally in those waters. They come from vessels, and the only vessel that would have been in that location dumping oil was a submarine trying to stay submerged for extended periods. And suddenly what had been farm boy superstition, according to Holloway, was looking like legitimate intelligence about ongoing enemy activity, and Morrison immediately escalated this up the chain of command. And within 2 hours there were Navy destroyers searching the area, and additional coastal observation posts were put on high alert, and everyone was taking the threat seriously. Everyone except Captain Holloway, who still insisted we'd gotten lucky with a coincidence. But here's where the story takes a turn that I still can't quite believe, even though I lived through it. 2 days after we reported the submarine activity, I was called into a meeting with Holloway and several other officers, including Morrison, and Holloway started the meeting by saying, "Gentlemen, we've completed analysis of the coastal defense grid in this sector, and we've identified a significant tactical vulnerability," and he proceeded to describe, in technical military language, exactly what I'd been trying to tell him for 2 days. He explained that enemy submarines could operate within visual range of our observation posts without being detected because of blind spots in our coverage. He explained that the reflections we'd been seeing were likely periscope observations. He explained that the oil slick confirmed prolonged submarine presence, and he proposed a series of tactical adjustments to eliminate the blind spots and improve our detection capabilities. And the whole time he's talking, I'm sitting there thinking, this is what I told you. This is exactly what Rodriguez and Kowalski and I figured out. You're describing our observations and calling them your analysis. And then Holloway did something that, looking back on it now, I think was probably the hardest thing he ever did in his military career. He looked directly at me and he said, "Private Dean, I owe you an apology. Your initial observations were correct and I dismissed them inappropriately. You identified a threat that I failed to recognize, and that's on me." And for a moment I didn't know what to say, because officers didn't apologize to enlisted men. That wasn't how the military worked. But here was Holloway publicly admitting he'd been wrong and I'd been right. And I said, "Sir, I was just doing my job." And Holloway said, "You were doing more than your job. You were doing mine, and I'm grateful you did." And in that moment I actually respected Holloway. I thought maybe I'd misjudged him. Maybe he was capable of growth and humility. Maybe this whole incident would be a turning point. Except that's not what happened. What happened was that 2 weeks later the official after-action report for the February 23rd incident was filed, and that report credited Captain Richard Holloway with identifying critical vulnerabilities in coastal observation protocols and implementing tactical improvements that significantly enhanced defensive capabilities. And my name wasn't mentioned, Rodriguez's name wasn't mentioned, Kowalski's name wasn't mentioned. Morrison got a brief acknowledgement for supporting command initiatives, but the entire narrative of the report suggested that Holloway had independently conducted analysis that revealed the blind spots and that he'd proactively corrected them. And I remember reading that report and feeling this cold understanding settle over me that the apology hadn't mattered, the moment of honesty hadn't mattered. What mattered was the official record, and the official record was going to tell whatever story protected the hierarchy. I went to Morrison and I asked him, "Sir, did you see the after-action report?" And Morrison said, "I saw it." And I said, "It ain't accurate, sir. That's not how it happened." And Morrison said, "Dean, let me explain something to you about how the Army works. The after-action report serves a purpose beyond documenting facts. It serves to maintain confidence in leadership. And right now, with the country in a panic after the submarine attack, the last thing anyone wants to hear is that coastal defenses were inadequate because a captain wasn't listening to his enlisted men. So the report tells a story that makes everyone look competent and prepared. And yes, that means your contribution gets erased. And I'm sorry about that, but that's how the system works. And fighting it won't change anything except make your life harder." And I said, "So we just accept lies in the official record?" And Morrison said, "We accept that the official record serves institutional needs, not historical accuracy. And yes, that's frustrating, but it's also how we maintain order and discipline. If enlisted men started getting credit for correcting officers' mistakes, then pretty soon enlisted men would start thinking they don't need to follow officers' orders. And that's a breakdown of military hierarchy that we can't allow." That conversation, that explanation from Morrison, who I respected and who was genuinely trying to help me understand, that's when I learned the most important lesson of my military career, which is that truth is less important than structure, facts are less important than hierarchy, and individuals are less important than institutions. And I ain't saying that's right, I'm just saying that's how it is. And if you want to survive in any large organization, you better accept that early, or you're gonna spend your whole career being frustrated and angry. And I decided right then that I wasn't gonna be angry. I was gonna do my job. I was gonna keep watching and noticing and reporting what I saw. And I was gonna accept that credit would flow upward and blame would flow downward, and there wasn't nothing I could do to change that except maybe, decades later, tell the real stories to anyone willing to listen. Captain Holloway got promoted 6 months later, made major, eventually made lieutenant colonel, served out the war in comfortable staff positions, never saw combat, retired with full honors, and his obituary when he died in 1987 described him as a dedicated officer who made significant contributions to coastal defense during the critical early days of the Pacific War. And that's technically true, he did make contributions, but the contributions came from him finally listening to people he'd initially dismissed, and those people never got mentioned in his obituary or anywhere else. But here's the thing I want you to understand. I ain't telling this story because I'm bitter about not getting credit. I'm 83 years old. I don't need credit. What I need is for people to understand how these systems work, how the official version of events gets created, and how many contributors get erased so that leadership can look competent. Let me tell you what happened with those tactical improvements that supposedly Holloway implemented, the blind spots we'd identified, the changes needed to fix them. All of that got rolled into new protocols for coastal observation that were adopted across the entire West Coast defense network, and those protocols probably saved lives, probably prevented additional submarine attacks, definitely improved our defensive posture, and if you look at military history books about home front defense in World War II, you'll find references to the February 1942 protocol enhancements, and you'll read that they were developed by coastal defense commands in response to the submarine incident. But you won't find any mention that those enhancements came from 3 enlisted men watching moonlight reflections and arguing with their captain. You won't find any acknowledgement that the entire command structure missed what ranch kids and mechanics spotted, because acknowledging that would undermine confidence in the professional military establishment. Now here's where this story takes its final turn, the turn I didn't see coming until years later. In 1947 I was out of the Army, I'd moved back to Texas, I was working my daddy's ranch again, and I got a letter, return address I didn't recognize. I opened it and it was from Holloway, Captain Holloway, who'd become Lieutenant Colonel Holloway, who was now retired Holloway, and the letter was 3 pages long, handwritten, and it was the most honest thing I ever received from a superior officer. He wrote, Dean, I've spent 5 years thinking about what happened that night in February 1942, and I need you to know that the apology I gave you in that meeting was real, but it wasn't enough. I took credit for your work. I built my career on insights that came from men I dismissed as farm boys, and I never had the courage to correct the record publicly. I told myself it was for institutional reasons, that I was protecting the Army's reputation, but the truth is I was protecting myself. I was protecting my career and my ego. And I'm sorry, I don't expect forgiveness and I don't deserve it. I just want you to know that I know what I did was wrong. And I hope you've had a good life despite not getting the recognition you deserved. I read that letter 3 times, didn't know what to make of it. Part of me wanted to be angry that it took him 5 years to say this. Part of me appreciated that he'd said it at all. And eventually I wrote back, kept it simple, said, Colonel, I appreciate the honesty. I learned a lot from what happened and it made me better at my job. No hard feelings. And we exchanged a couple more letters over the years. Never became friends but developed a kind of mutual respect. And when Holloway died in 1987, his son sent me a copy of his father's personal papers, and in those papers was Holloway's own account of what happened in February 1942, and his version matched mine almost exactly. He'd written down the truth even though the official record told a different story, and I think he did that because he wanted someone, somewhere, to know what actually happened even if it never became public. And that's when I understood that Holloway wasn't a villain, he was just a product of the system. He did what the system rewarded and avoided what the system punished, and if you want to blame someone you gotta blame the system, not the individual people following its incentives. So what's the lesson here? What's the point of me telling you this story 83 years after the fact? I think the lesson is that organizations protect themselves by controlling narratives. They create official records that serve institutional interests rather than historical accuracy, and the people who actually do the work often get erased to make leadership look competent. And this happens in the military, but it also happens in corporations and governments and nonprofits and churches. And every other institution humans create, because institutions care more about maintaining authority than about acknowledging the contributions of people at the bottom of the hierarchy. And if you're at the bottom and you do something important, you need to understand that you probably won't get credit. Your contribution will probably be attributed to someone higher up. And fighting this won't change anything, but accepting it don't mean you have to like it, don't mean you can't preserve the real story for future generations, don't mean you can't tell the truth even if the official record says something different. I kept all my notes from that week in February 1942. I kept the documentation of the reflections we saw. I kept copies of the reports we filed. I kept Holloway's letters. And I kept that photograph with the pencil notation that says blind spot confirmed Dean observation validated post-incident. And now I'm making all of it available because I think people deserve to know how history actually happens versus how it gets recorded, and the difference between those two things is usually the difference between protecting individuals who did the work and protecting institutions that take the credit. And I'm old enough now that I don't care about protecting institutions. I care about truth. I care about making sure the men who actually spotted the submarine threat get acknowledged even if it's 80 years too late. And I care about teaching young people that doing good work don't guarantee recognition, but it's still worth doing because results matter even when credit goes elsewhere. Rodriguez died in 1993. Kowalski died in 2001. Morrison made it to 2008. They all lived good lives, had families, never complained about not getting credit for what we did. And I think that's because we understood something important, which is that the satisfaction comes from knowing you did the right thing, from knowing your work mattered, from knowing that protocols changed and lives were saved because you paid attention when others didn't, and whether your name appears in history books is less important than whether the work actually got done. But now that they're gone and I'm the last one left, I figure somebody should tell the full story. Somebody should say their names. Rodriguez and Kowalski and Morrison and Dean, we're the ones who spotted what command missed. We're the ones who identified the blind spots. We're the ones who pushed for changes that improved coastal defense. And even though the official record gives credit elsewhere, we know what we did, and now you know it. 2. One more thing before I finish this story. I want to show you something. I got here a copy of a Navy intelligence report from March 1942, 1 month after the submarine incident. And this report analyzes Japanese submarine operations along the West Coast, and buried in the appendices there's a section on detection improvements. And that section mentions enhanced observation protocols based on field observations from coastal units, and if you know what you're looking for, you can see our contribution in that language. Field observations from coastal units is bureaucratic code for enlisted men spotted something officers missed. And I think whoever wrote this report knew the real story and wanted to preserve some acknowledgement of it even if they couldn't be explicit, and that's good enough for me. That's as close to official recognition as we're ever gonna get, and I'm okay with that because I know the truth and now you know it too. So that's the story of how a Texan farm boy and 2 other enlisted men spotted a Japanese submarine threat that the entire command structure missed, and how we identified critical vulnerabilities in coastal defenses, and how those vulnerabilities got fixed, but we didn't get credit because the system needed to protect officer competence, and how one captain eventually apologized privately but never publicly, and how the official record tells a sanitized version that erases our contribution, and how I'm telling the real version now because truth matters even when institutions try to bury it. And if you found this story valuable, please share it, please preserve it. Please help make sure that Rodriguez and Kowalski and Morrison get remembered for what they actually did instead of what the after-action reports say they did, because these buried files, these hidden truths, they're important. They teach us how power works and how credit flows and how individuals get sacrificed to protect institutional narratives, and understanding that is essential if you want to navigate any large organization without becoming bitter or cynical. You gotta accept the game is rigged, but you gotta keep playing it anyway because the work itself matters regardless of who gets recognized, and that's the real lesson from February 1942. Not that I was smart or heroic or special, but that I did my job even knowing credit would go elsewhere, and that's what professionalism actually means, doing what needs doing regardless of recognition, and I hope that lesson serves you as well as it served me.